Why on earth should we take culture seriously? Well, you could give complicated answers, but two simple ones would be a positive one and a negative one. The positive one is a desire to witness. Unless we understand the setting, the world in which people live, we'll never really communicate well to them. And a lot of apologists address people as if they're all ideas, rather than people who are living in particular situations in the world. So the desire to witness is a very key imperative. The negative reason is the danger of worldliness. Now, as you know well, a lot of Christians think of worldliness as little no-nos. Don't drink, don't dance, don't smoke, things like that. And they were common when I was a boy. And then came the 1960s, and in the name of freedom, all those were thrown out. And now many parts of the church have no category of worldliness. But the fact is that the advanced modern world is more powerful and more pervasive and more pressurizing than any face of the world up till now. And not surprisingly, many Christians are profoundly worldly because they never analyze the world. So take your pick, either the desire to witness or the danger of worldliness. We need to understand the world. Now then again, you have another choice. Because most of apologetics, since it only looks at ideas, its main tool is the history of ideas. Ideas, if you understand its family tree, its ancestry. Now the trouble is many apologists stop with that because they only look at philosophical ideas. But how do you understand the world? Well, there's a discipline. The technical name is the Sociology of Knowledge, an ugly word. Simpler way of putting it, cultural analysis. An analysis of the whole of the culture in which we're living. Now, the history of ideas looks at hard ideas. Cultural analysis looks at the way people's worlds shape their thinking, even if there's no thinkers involved at all. Now, in the interest of that, I want to pick up the question this afternoon of consumerism. Consumerism. Now, you wouldn't have that in a lot of traditional apologetics. It's not a matter of ideas. But in fact, as we'll see, consumerism in the advanced modern world is incredibly powerful and needs to be taken into account looking at apologetics and how we witness to people. So I hope you're with me on that. That lies behind everything I'm saying. But why consumerism? If I was to ask you, what was the most extraordinary features of the last century? World wars, atomic bombs, moon landing, creation of the computer, cracking the DNA. You could roll off all sorts of things. First, manned flight. You could roll off all sorts of things. But you know, many people would miss out what a lot of people think is one of the most extraordinary features, which is the rise of consumer society, through which more people live at a level of prosperity than in any generation in human history. And it has extraordinary significance for the gospel. Now, consumerism can be looked at in all sorts of ways, and we haven't time for it this afternoon. You could look at all the goods or the consumer spaces. You know that shopping malls are described as the cathedrals of the modern world. You could look at branding and theming and all the things that have risen like identity theft and consumer credit crimes and so on. A huge number of things could come under the idea of consumerism, including the great heroes of the consumer world, say Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. These are people who are described as the Christopher Columbuses of the consumer world with their dazzling new goods that are brought to all of us. Or you could look at many of the famous sayings. I don't know all your languages, of course, but in English, we have a whole stream of sayings. Veni, vidi, visa. I shop, therefore I am. To buy is to be. You are what you buy. When in doubt, shop. When the going gets tough, the tough go shopping. And you can see classically after 9/11, what was one of George Bush's first things? Let's get back to shopping. And so on and so on and so on. Now let me define what I mean by consumerism. Objectively, consumerism is a way of life built on the centrality of appropriating goods and things. That's what we're talking about. Subjectively, it's a way of life where human well-being is assessed in terms of our success in appropriating goods. In other words, consumerism is a major enduring feature of our modern world. It's one of the master categories to understand modern identities and modern ways of life. And it's absolutely indispensable to understanding the spiritual condition of modern people. Why now? Well, there's a strong understanding today that we need to provide a powerful, constructive criticism of capitalism. Not just because of the 2008 recession, but partly because of that. You can see that whatever idealistic view of capitalism people have, and many Christians have a very romantic, idealistic, simplistic view, two things have happened to capitalism in the 20th century which have changed it almost out of recognition. First, what's called financializations. So the capitalism is no longer the real economy, that businesses making money, but things that happen in the City of London and Wall Street and so on, much of which no one understands. And it was those things like the credit default swaps which got us in trouble in 2008. So, on the one hand, capitalism is hugely distorted by financialization. On the other hand, capitalism now has a consumer culture. This is capitalism at the ordinary person's level, and it's having a tremendous impact. I personally would not be able to give you a critique of financialization. I don't understand it in much of its complexity, and I'm comforted by many economists and business people don't understand it, although many of them are growing rich through it, but that's another question. I couldn't critique that. But we can look rather more easily at consumerism, and that's what I want to do. Because consumerism stands in strong contrast to our Christian faith. It also stands in contrast to classical humanism and to most of the other world religions. And yet, very few Christians in the Western world have really taken the trouble to analyze it. It is a key part of the world in which we're called to be in, but not of. And so we need to understand it. Now, it's very difficult. For one reason, it's controversial raising these topics in Christian circles because immediately you're thought to be a left-winger, a Marxist, a pinko, or whatever the term is. But the other reason it's really difficult to discuss is that there is no alternative at the moment. In other words, it's rather like discussing slavery in the first century. Paul writes to Philemon about Onesimus and so on, but there's no foreseeable way of anything that's different from slavery. And so the seeds of the principles of the gospel you can see in Paul's letter, but there's no way they're going to change the institution of chattel slavery in the Roman Empire or for a long time. And in the same way, there isn't any alternative to consumer society or to contemporary capitalism yet. And yet, that doesn't stop us thinking Christianly about it, and where we have to challenge it, do so in our thoughts and our living. So you with me? That's what we're looking at this afternoon, and that's why. Let me put out a number of propositions. We won't have time to do them all in depth, because I hope to throw it open to you. I'm not for a moment pretending to have all the answers to these, but I want to describe some of the challenges, and we've all got to work on the answers over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. First, how do we trace the rise of consumer culture. It's a maxim in the social sciences never to look for a single explanation. They're always wrong. Look for as many contributing explanations as you can, what are called multi-causal explanations, and you'll get close to it. It's dangerous here, and I'm going to say there isn't any one single explanation. We've also got to be very careful, and this is also very important in thinking, to be clear about our baseline. In other words, what are we contrasting today's world to? We could talk about traditional culture in ways that are simplistic and romantic. And we've got to realize that before the rise of consumer culture, most people lived around the subsistence level, a little above, sadly many below. In other words, it was not a pretty situation. And many people in a consumer culture have a much, much better life. So we must never romanticize tradition. But at its best, and sometimes it was, the traditional world before the consumer society put a premium on self-sufficiency, on community, on the local culture, and above all on hard work and thrift and savings. So you could think, say, there was consumption. Let's take the local shop in the traditional world. In the local shop in the traditional world, the range of goods was very, very limited. And of course, it was all about what people needed. Needs, real needs. Clothes, food, and tools, above all, for farming. And in that simple local shop, there was no packaging at all. There were no brands at all. The key element of trust was not in the label or the brands, it was in the shopkeeper. And you had an entirely different system. Now, how did it change? Well, let me mention three things that have contributed to the rise of our modern world. First, the emergence of fashion as the display of power and wealth. If you think, there's a key difference between fashion and clothes. Clothes were always functional. They were to do with needs, and you hoped that they lasted. Whereas fashion, from the very beginning, was ever-changing and nothing to do with what you needed. There was a link between fashion and the display of power and wealth and status. So, those at the very top set the fashions, and in the early days that was the royals and the nobles. And they had the power and the wealth to turn over fashions, which expressed their capacity to do so and their superiority, and nobody else had fashions. In Europe, there were even what were called sumptuary or clothing laws. You probably know that up to the medieval times, only princes and knights and their ladies were allowed to wear brocade by law. Velvet was absolutely legally restricted to patricians. Now this began to change with the incoming of wealth. So the nobles had fashions and nobody else. And then in the Renaissance, the merchants started to prosper and they started to imitate and mimic the nobles in their buying of clothes, in their display of art and books and library and sculpture and so on. These things were not necessary. Yes, they were true and good and beautiful and all that, but they were a symbol, a display of the new wealth which they had. So Queen Elizabeth I in England urged her aristocrats to display their fashions. No one had never done that before. When you get to the 17th century in France, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Minister of Finance, he gave a speech to the French. With our taste, with our taste, fashion, with our taste, let us make war on Europe, and through fashion, we will conquer the world. French haute couture, and they've conquered the world ever since, in clothes and all sorts of things down to perfumes. And so you can see the rise of wealth beginning to spread meant a rise of fashion displaying it. That was enormously helped by the mercantile revolution. And as European sailors and others were able to go around the world, they brought things back, and the first consumer goods were all from the colonies. Things we take for granted today: coffee, tea, sugar, chocolate, spices, tobacco. And these were actually the things that were the first to come back as consumer goods. And you can see, if you'd gone to the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851 in England, this incredible array of stuff which had come in from all around the empire. And the French did it in the exhibition in Paris and so on. Well, that had a huge reinforcement in the third stage, which was the Industrial Revolution. And now with this massive capacity to produce, it was domestic goods which became popular, not just goods from the colonies, but domestic goods. And now they can be turned out in the factories and so on and so on and so on. So you can see the steady rise of fashion and consumerism. And it led at the end of the 19th century to one American sociologist famously called conspicuous consumption. In other words, you consume things and even waste. Waste was a grand statement of power. You could afford to be wasteful. You could afford the ostentatious, the unnecessary, the ridiculous, and so on, because you were wealthy enough to do it. Here's a poem. I don't know if those of you from other, I should get an American to read it because it's in sort of popular American, but I'll read it with an English accent, describing a New York senator in the 1890s. Senator Copper of Tonopah Ditch made a clear billion in mining and such. Hiked to New York where his money he blew, building a palace on Fifth Avenue. How, says the senator, can I look proudest? Build me a house that will holler the loudest. And you got these magnificent mansions all over New York and so on that were the extraordinary display of conspicuous consumption. All right, let's go on more importantly to understand the key shifts, because we take it for granted. We're like a fish swimming in water. All our modern societies in the advanced modern world are consumer cultures. We take it for granted. But what actually were the changes that took place? Well, there are three pillars of a consumer society: mass production, mass consumption, and thirdly, and very importantly, mass motivation. Now, the second and the third didn't exist once, and they're not self-evident. So the first shift in a consumer society is the shift from mass production to mass motivation. So when the Industrial Revolution took off, suddenly this incredible capacity to produce goods at a level and a speed and all that beyond anyone's imagination. Trouble was, the warehouses, the inventories were packed and it just sat there. So they realized we got to shift from mass production to mass motivation. We've not only got to make the stuff, we've got to sell the stuff. And this was the beginning of very important things. This was the beginning, say, of advertising. Now, we take that for granted again, but it was radical in our time. One executive in the 1900s described advertising as the ignition switch of the economy. Another one said, consumer engineering does not end until we can consume all that we can produce. Another one in 1920 said, the future of business lies in its capacity to manufacture customers as well as products. Dorothy Sayers, well-known Christian writer, she was actually handling the account for our family brewery, Guinness, And she was the one who coined the very famous little phrase, which sounds so obvious, people wonder why it was radical in time. It pays to advertise, and so on. You can see enormous changes in the rise of advertising. The shift from a hard sell, where they gave you facts, to a soft sell, where they gave you emotional connotations, and so on. And above all, the rise of the science of market research. What's interesting was, much of the early advertising followed psychology. Freud's own nephew was one of the leading advertisers. And in the early days, they were absolutely open about their paternalism and their open deception. Here's an ad man in 1920. And obviously, you wouldn't talk like this today, but this is how brazen they were with the rise of advertising. He said, I'm writing about Mr. and Mrs. Moron and their little morons. After all, men and women in the mass are apt to have incredibly shallow brain pans. In infancy, they're attracted by bright colors and glitter and noise. And in adulthood, they retain a surprisingly similar set of basic reactions. Now, no one would dare say something as crude as that today, but it just shows you they realized they were in the business of an irrational deception of the public. Here's Freud's nephew, leading advertiser in the 1920s. If we understand the mechanism and the motive of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing it. Again, who would dare say something as candid as that today? Here's T.S. Eliot, who of course disagreed with it as a Christian writer. He was attacking it, but he said advertising today, this is way back in the 20s, is the influence of the masses by men by any means except through their intelligence. Now, we're used to this. Vance Packard later wrote The Hidden Persuaders. And we're used, but we should be critical of the irrationality of much advertising. And certainly we should be looking at the intrusiveness of it everywhere. I mean, think the percentage of a television program today. Or think of the pop-up ads, which are so, you want to get to your little item on the internet, and you have to listen to 20 seconds of some wretched thing. Think of the product placements, the millions they'll play to have a bottle of this or that, or a cologne shown in some feature film, and so on. And you can see how absurd this has become in our day. There was an American series called Dawson's Creek back in the 1990s, which was drama for teens. And it was totally tied in with J. Crew. All the stars wore J. Crew clothes. They were on the front cover of the J. Crew catalog. And they openly talked about it in all their issues of the programs that came out. It was absolutely an incestuous relationship, and yet it was so average that people accepted it. So you can see over the 20th century this rise from production to mass motivation. The second great shift is what's called the shift from Fordism to post-Fordism. That was Gramsci, the Italian philosopher's word. Fordism is Henry Ford, the production line, the industrial unit, and so on. Post-Fordism is our world more today, which grew up in the 60s, where you have just-in-time delivery, or you have niche marketing, or whatever, or personalized goods, where now, with all computers and so on, we can mass-produce things, but they're no longer mass-produced goods. They really are individualized in all sorts of ways that are far more flexible in our postmodern age. But beyond that, there are a whole series of fascinating shifts that the consumer revolution represents. And I'll mention some of these that are key. First, the shift from thrift to debt. Now, this is very important for us as Christians to realize. The early consumer gurus, the early advertisers, quite explicitly say they're up against three forces: poverty, the Protestant ethic, and the pioneer spirit. Why? Well, if you're poor, you couldn't afford anything. But if you had the Protestant ethic or the pioneer spirit, you lived frugally and you didn't measure your life with stuff. So quite deliberately, they're out to undermine Christian ethics and anything that approaches it. Let me give you one quotation. Here's the chairman of Allied Stores back in the 1910s. Again, incredibly candid in a way no one would be today. It is our job to make women unhappy with what they have. We must make women so unhappy that their husbands can find no happiness or peace in their excessive saving. Here he goes on. Advertising is the great force at work against the traditional economy of an age-long poverty, as well as that of our pioneer spirit. It is almost the only force at work that can undercut Puritanism in consumption. Now, if you're thinking, the scriptures teach us that if we're in debt, we're in slavery. The scripture's so clear on the problem of debt, they had to undermine that attitude, the Protestant ethic, so that people would willingly go into debt to fuel a consumer society. But sadly, there was next to no Christian response at the time. All this was going on. Now this, of course, touched all sorts of things. A second enormous shift in this area is the shift from identity being in terms of class and occupation to being identity in terms of lifestyle and personal identity. This is incredibly important. Think of what Glenn Harrison was saying last night. For better or worse, and it wasn't good, traditional identity tended to be according to your class in society and your occupation. In English, we have many, many names, surnames still, that represent what people did. Smith, Cooper, Baker, and all these sort of things. Your class or your occupation gave you your identity. That isn't good. Glenn said last night, it should have been the Lord who gives us our identity. But under the impact of consumer society, that shifted, and no one cares about that now. They began to see that we can get people to buy things and make that the source of their way of life and their identity. In other words, the music you buy, the clothes you wear, the cars you drive, the vacations you consume, these become the things that are expression of who you are. Now, there are reasons for the new flexibility. We were at, some of us at Jürgen Spiess's wonderful seminar on Dostoevsky, quoting his great famous line, if God is dead, everything's permitted. Peter Berger, the social scientist, picked up on that, and he points out in our modern world, if God is dead, any self is possible. There's total fluidity, total absence of fixity about identity. So the consumers and the marketers come in and say, in essence, buy this, buy that, buy the other, whether it's experiences like a holiday or clothes, shoes, cars, or whatever, and this will say who you are. And sadly, again, it wasn't challenged. Let me give you an example of it. Here's a classic example of it. Well, let me go back to the 1920s when they figured out how well this ought to work. Here's an industrialist in the 20s. We need to go beyond the old industrial advertising to some new philosophy of life advertising. We need to create the commodity self. Think of the teenager buying sneakers and saying who he is. People murdering others for sneakers, because it's now the commodity self, the expression of who we are. But you have classic forms of that today. Take, say, the American Express card. Let me just read you. Here's the advertising line for the American Express, the Amex Gold card. The close of a fine meal, presentation of the bill, and you take out the gold card. It is a gesture that speaks volumes. The gold card says more about you than anything that you can buy with it. We think it's time that you join the select group who carry the gold card. Now, are we taken in by that sort of nonsense? Yes, sadly, most people are. But you can see that shift in identity. You are what you buy, and you buy what you want to say you are out into the public arena. Betty Friedan, who was one of the early feminists, she used to get angry at this. And in her book, The Feminine Mystique, she quotes one of the ad executives. Here's the ad executive she quotes. Having a go at the housewives again, forgive me, women. He says, properly manipulated, again, who would say that now? Properly manipulated, American housewives can be given the sense of identity, purpose, creativity, self-realization, even sexual joy that they lack by buying things. Come on, who believes that sort of nonsense? Where are the Christians who denounce this sort of nonsense? Now, you've got takeoffs of that. Some of you may have seen the film Fight Club, where the protagonist is picking up an IKEA Swedish catalogue, and he says, what kind of plates define me as a person? He's mocking it, of course, but you can see he's understood what these things are. You are what you buy, how you want to express yourself to be, and so on and so on. Another very crucial shift in the consumer revolution was the shift from adults to children. And this becomes even more manipulative. It was consumer thinkers in the 50s, with the post-World War II prosperity, who coined the term teenager and the notion of the tweens. And they talked of the kidults and so on. But where are we today? Well, I'm living in America currently, but I'll just say this. By 18 months, American babies can recognize logos. By the age of 2, they can ask for products by their brand names. By nursery school, American kids ask for 25 products a day on average. By primary school, American kids are capable of identifying 200 logos. Here's the one that horrified me, having brought up my beloved son in the US, although he was born in England. Between the ages of 6 and 12, American kids spend more time shopping than reading, playing outdoors, and conversations with their families together. Doesn't sound horrifying compared with sex trafficking, but you can see the sort of people that it will start to produce. Now, the only last contrast I'll mention is one that comes up a lot. I'm not quite convinced by it, but the people who describe it are describing something fascinating. I'm not quite sure why. So I'll give you what they say, and you can come to your own conclusions, and if you can help me, you can. You're welcome to. They point out that with the rise of consumer culture, we have shifted from a very solid material world to a highly immaterial world. Now, let me give you a whole lot of examples, and you put it together for yourself and see what you can make of it. But 2 quotations that go back to the beginning. Karl Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, all that is solid melts into air. And that theme of solidity melting is a key theme today. You take families melting down institutionally. Friedrich Nietzsche, looking at the same thing, he said famously, when God dies in a culture, the culture becomes weightless. Marx, solid melts into air. Nietzsche, God's death, cultures become weightless. Think of Daniel, weighed in the balances and found wanting. Well, now here are the contrasts that the scholars point out. With the rise of consumer culture over the last 150 years, men have gone from stout to lean. The Victorian gentleman prided himself on his paunch. Oh, horrifying today. You've got to have the ripped abs. Women have gone from plump to anorexic. Again, the Victorian matron was a plump creature, and that was considered part of beauty. Not today. Reputation has gone from character to image. Character is who you are when no one sees. Image is external. Buildings have gone from stone to glass and steel. Money has gone from gold to plastic. Markets have gone from credit to debt, and from a real economy to an abstract economy. Citizens have gone from face-to-face debating to opinion polls, market research, and horse races. Speech has gone from substance to style. Now, I don't know what you make of all those. They have all happened, but exactly how that's the product of the consumer culture, I'm not quite sure. But there's something in that that's worth looking at because of where we began. And in Scripture, the notion of glory is weightiness. And weightlessness is what the idols are and what eventually is blown away by the winds of history. But anyway, you think of that one for yourself. On to a third point. I better speed up. Appreciate the significance for individual consumers. If this has happened, what does it mean for individual consumers? Well, first, it encourages self-creation and false identities. We each create ourselves, and we can pretend to be, by what we drive and the things we wear, etc., who we really aren't. Now, of course, pretending to be what we're not is not only part of hypocrisy, it's part of the nature of the fallenness of sin. So we've got to watch that carefully. Here's a Cambridge sociologist, a famous one. The consumption of ever-novel goods becomes a substitute for the genuine development of self. We don't think much now about real growth, the formation of character, and what it means to live a good life. Everything now is self-creation. And of course, if you think of what that means, it means first, we're other-directed. Because we're buying, driving, all these things in order to be seen. Here's one ad executive. My idea of myself is my idea of my neighbor's view of me. Well, that's appalling. Think of what Glenn said last night. We are who God knows we are and calling us to be. My idea of myself is rather my idea of my neighbor's view of me. Another feature of this self-creation is the ever-changing disposable identities. Think of someone like Michael Jackson, or Madonna, or above all today, our German rock star, Lady Gaga. I mean, every single event she's at, she's someone new. And this is typical of our modern world and a consumer culture. We're all in the business of doing that every day and in every new sort of way. And so life becomes a strategy for what's called impression management. We're on the stage, and we are the impresarios to the images we want to create to impress people, to have power, to influence people, and so on. How to win friends and influence people, a famous bestseller. And you could go on and on and on. So it reinforces that dangerous human idea of self-creation and also hypocrisy. Secondly, it frankly reinforces sin. How many of the 7 deadly sins do you think consumerism openly appeals to? Throw out a few. Greed. Gordon Gekko, greed is good. Oh, dear me, all right? Pride, yes. On the one hand, you could say envy, keeping up with the Joneses. On the other hand, pride, I want to be different from the Joneses, distancing myself from the Joneses, showing that I'm select, superior, and so on. And you can see how different ads appeal to different things very openly. Anything else that strikes you? What? Lust, very obviously. I mean, my family was in the brewing business. You won't find a single bimbo in any Guinness ads. I thank the Lord for that. They've used animals and wit and things, but all American ads. You know, the Coors twins and sort of buxom bimbos in all sorts of ways. Clearly, they associate lust and beer for some reason, you know, and so on. But underlying it all, you can think of how consumerism is appealing to disordered desires. And of course, at the end of the day, the irony is that while we're given the idea that our choices and our consumptions give us freedom, consumer societies have led to more addictions than ever before in history. And you have this extraordinary irony. America is the land of the free. Half of America is in recovering groups from various addictions of one kind and another. And it's not actually all that surprising if you look at it, because there's a close reinforcement of sin. The third effect on the individual is just the accumulation of stuff and junk. We all, and I include myself, I was horrified. We lost our house through toxic mold, and we had to clear out and strip our house down to the bricks, throw away half my books and a lot of our furniture and things. But we were stunned, thinking we lived relatively simply, how much extraordinary amount of stuff we had we didn't need. And you have thinkers like, say, William Morris in the 19th century, the great artist, who said, buy nothing that you don't know to be useful and believe to be beautiful. Now, half the consumer goods would disappear, or more than half if you practice that, but of course we don't, and our world is filled with far too much stuff. How much land does a man need? You may have read Tolstoy's great fable, it's worth reading. Let's look fourthly at the consequences for our global consumer culture. The first obvious consequence is the promotion of debt. Now you know this. Scriptures and the best of Christian history and other religions like Islam are very vigilant about debt. And yet we in our Western Christian culture have gone hook, line, and sinker for debt under the impact of consumer culture. And whether it's the financial markets leveraging debt or individuals leveraging debt, you can see how debt has come in. I needn't expand that anymore. The first ads for the credit cards, Bank of America, 1956. The first ads for the credit cards were, it takes the waiting out of wanting. Wow. Analyze that one. It takes the waiting out of wanting. So under the Puritan ethic, or the Christian understanding, you worked and saved until you could afford, and then you bought. Now we own our goods before we've even paid for them or worked for them. And so that the delayed gratification, as Max Weber put it, is gone, and we have instant gratification. And debt, for many of us, is omnipresent in our world. The second global consequence, and that first one is very profound, and the question for the Western economics is, can we escape this world of debt? The second one, equally important, and I needn't say much about it, the product of waste. One of Italo Calvini's novels, Invisible Cities. He has all these cities described, and one of them, Leonia, is a city that takes great pride not only in what it produces and creates, but what it sends out every day in waste. Now, he's satirizing, caricaturing our Western world. We don't think of that. Used to be said in the 19th century, every factory sends out 2 trucks, 2 lorries. One, the new product. The other, the waste. If we think of the new product, we don't often think of the waste. And we need to. Take something as simple we've thought about in the last few years, plastic bags. Wrapping is pollution waiting to happen. Plastic bag was only invented 30 years ago. And now 500 billion are created and used every year. More than 1 million in every minute. I'm told there's an island in the Pacific, the size of France, just made up of floating plastic bags that have gone down there. You think what we're doing to our world. Then the third impact globally is just the crisis of sustainability. Put simply, if the so-called BRICS, not the advanced world, but countries like China, India, Brazil, and so on, if they were to consume at the level we're consuming in Western Europe and North America, we would need 3 planets to be able to afford to continue. And obviously that leaves out much of the rest of the world. Consumer society needs to be checked for the sake of the world itself. I won't go into the ethics of the resistance of it, but the only important thing to say there is every time there's been a resistance movement against consumerism, consumerism has co-opted it. So even take something like Bono's The Red Project and so on, it has done remarkably little. But instead of discussing that, let me read you an ad for Perry Ellis. Okay, a Perry Ellis fragrance for men. I'll just read you the ad straight from the copy, and you tell me, listening to this, what the ad is saying and why it's clever, okay? A men's cologne. You see a male model, open neck shirt, ripped abs, clearly defined torso. Here's the copy line. Now, I want you to comment on it when I'm finished. I hate this job. I'm not simply an empty suit who stands in front of a camera, collects the money and flies off to Saint Martin for the weekend. I'm a model for a living, but I hate being treated like a piece of meat. I once had a loudmouth art director say, "Stand there and pretend you're a human." I wanted to punch him, but I needed the job. Oh yeah, and about this fragrance, it's good, it's very good. When I posed for this picture, the art director, a real nice woman, she insisted I wear this stuff while the pictures were being taken. I thought it was silly, but I said, what the heck, it's their money. After a while, I realized I liked this fragrance a lot. When the photo shoot was over, I walked right over and picked up the bottle and put it in my pocket and said, "If you don't mind, I'd like to take this as a souvenir." Then I smiled my best FU smile and walked out. Next time I'll pay for it. It's that good. All right, now tell me how that works. These are the sort of things you see every day. When my son was 8 to 10, I've told people, we had a little game, Spot the Lie. I would give him a quarter, an American quarter, for every lie he could see in an ad. An irrational claim, a nonsense non sequitur, or whatever. We didn't do it for very long. He was getting too much from me. But it bred a skepticism. He was able to read advertisements and commercials. Read that for me. You expound the scriptures, you pastors, or whatever. Expound that ad. Come on, someone have the guts to have a go. And that's the clever of it. It knows we all have resistance to ads. We're all cynical now. So it plays on our cynicism to overcome it and to sell us something despite it. And, you know, these things work and they're all figuring it out. And behind a lot of this stuff is not only sociological demographics, but also psychology. And much advertising is just psychology reversed so that you can really manipulate people. Now, let me just finish with one last point. What are the apologetic points of significance for consumerism? First, let's be blunt, they have redefined the good life. Now, obviously, the scriptures has a very clear understanding of the good person, Jesus. the good people that we're to be like Jesus, and the good life, the way of Jesus. And that view of the scripture is much closer to the classics. And for the classics, the good life was always to do with the true, the good, and the beautiful. But now, the good life has become a life of goods. And we've got to really see it's a very different world that leads to unhappiness, not happiness, and we need to challenge it very strongly. Secondly, it gives us an idolatry of things, of desires, of change, of impressions and public opinion and various things like that, all of which we should be tackling. But most importantly of all, if you think the consumer society promotes restless hearts, it's the greatest reinforcement of restlessness the world has ever seen. Now, of course, we know from St. Augustine, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, he prays to the Lord. But there's never been a reinforcement of restlessness as there is in consumerism. And really, consumerism is a matter of insatiable ideas. Buy this and you'll be satisfied. But often the thing has a built-in obsolescence. And then, of course, whatever you buy, next year's model will be better. The latest is, you haven't got an iPhone 5? Oh my word, but now the iPhone 5, Apple's running scared. Some of the new ones are looking better than Apple. I'm stuck on a BlackBerry, good heavens. Once the BlackBerry was the state-of-the-art phone, and now iPhone 5 put it in the shade, and now iPhone 5's on the way out. It's always the next thing. And so we chase ever after the relevant and the new, and so on. And one could go deeper. So I want to stop there. But I hope you really think, here is a key feature of our modern world. At the very highest level, I hope that by God's grace, in the next 50 years, some Christian sister or brother will be like, say, Michael Schluter in Cambridge, working on a new understanding of capitalism. He calls it relational capitalism, and profound thinking coming out of the Jubilee Center in Cambridge. We need people with the courage to look at capitalism, not be afraid to tackle it. We're not going to be destructive and left-wing like, say, Karl Marx, but to have a benign, constructive alternative to capitalism as it now is. But then we need, day by day, and in our teaching in other ways, to challenge many of the ideals and the ethics of consumer society. And then in our witnessing and our apologetics, we need to know how to see that consumerism, it shapes people's thinking just as much as humanism or relativism or whatever. So that we're using not just the history of ideas, but cultural analysis. And where I began, there's a danger of worldliness. Unless we understand the world, we may be shaped by the world rather than shape it. But I'm more interested today on the desire to witness, because everyone in the Western world that we're really witnessing to are partly shaped by these consumerisms. So we've got to really tackle this to understand it and then reply constructively.